Hello, I'm Brian Fox. Welcome to my channel, I Hate Rock Music. And today I want to talk about Revolution number 9 by the Beatles, which I think is magnificent. And so the backstory, as I've mentioned in a couple of videos, when the single Hey Jude came out, backed by the electric version of Revolution, it changed my whole life. For some reason, I'd listened to music on transistor radios and whatnot before that, and I really liked a lot of music. But Hey Jude came out, and the sophistication of it really, for some reason, was a life-changing event. And then I got the White Album. This was 1968. I was 11 years old. And I got the White Album, and it totally blew my mind, my poor little 11-year-old mind. And I loved everything about it. I loved how much variety there was, how much interesting instrumentation, just an incredible variety of material and songs, and everybody singing, just everything about it. And I got to Revolution 9, number 9, and for some reason I really had no problem with it. The complete kaleidoscopic aspects of the White Album, it just made sense to me, even 11 years old. And I grew to love the song early on. And it wasn't until later years, probably 4, 5, 6 years after that, that I started getting exposed to experimental composers like John Cage and Stockhausen, and realized what I was listening to even more. And I know Paul McCartney's talked about Carl Stockhausen's Hymnen, which is one of my favorite experimental electronic pieces of sound collage, music concrete, whatever you want to call it. And so what the Beatles did started to make more and more sense to me. And I I didn't really have any problems with it listening to it when I was 11, even in a vacuum, not being exposed to any of that kind of music. To me, it was just a more interesting sound and just more adventure, and it was very exciting to me. And so over the years, I've seen the discussion back and forth of people that love Revolution number 9 and people that hate it, and all the discussions of it. And I think it's interesting to see these conversations. It depends on what you're looking for. For me, um, I loved rock and roll per se, but this experiment in sound collage and just pure sound made total sense to me. And as I pointed out, just the sense of adventure. And I definitely appreciate the fact that the Beatles had that sense of adventure to include it on the White Album. And it's also quite a statement that one, John Lennon put this piece of music together, but then through consensus, it was given permission to be put on this record. And I think it's a wonderful story about John giving a demonstration to everyone of what he'd been working on. And everyone's reactions were a little different. I guess George Harrison, Ringo Starr were a little quiet and dumbstruck. Paul seemed to say it's okay, it's pretty good. And but he didn't reel, of course, because he'd been doing sound collage work since 1965, as it turns out. We find out later he'd been working on experimental music and sound collages for years, so it certainly didn't startle him. Of course, one of the things I think that's interesting is the interviews that are out there now, and George Martin now claims to love the piece. I'm sure he was a little taken aback. Anyone that thought that the Beatles didn't bring their best material to the Let It Be album obviously would have had some issues with that piece of music back in 1968 and what his vision of what the Beatles were. And also, George Harrison, of course, ventured into a lot of experimental music of his own, released an album of electronic sounds um, where he just kind of fooled around with various electronics and made a lot of interesting music or sounds. Just the fact that he called it electronic sounds makes me realize that he wasn't necessarily thinking of it as musical construction per se, as just an interesting aspect of what these new instruments could do. And Paul, of course, had some mixed feelings about the time, particularly including it on the White Album. But as the years go on, it's pretty convenient for him to talk about how much he loves it. And So I take the idea that he was fine with it at the time with a grain of salt. It's easy to look back in retrospect, but I got to hand it to the Beatles to be adventurous enough to for John to have created it, and then for the consensus to include it on the White Album. And I also understand that apparently the Beatles enjoyed it enough. Paul was probably a little taken aback that this piece of music was produced and he didn't really have much to do with it, so that was probably more of an issue with him. And then Ringo and George actually helped go into the library and select more sound effects out of the sound effects library that George Martin had in the EMI library of sound effects. And so they helped construct it. But John basically talks about the fact that George Martin helped him with the same thing, collecting sound effects and getting into the library and getting sound effects and things to add, and a couple of the Beatles did. But John talks about the fact that he supposedly spent 4 hours working on it with 10 loops and all these samples. And when you look at the recording logs, it obviously took longer than that, and the piece was worked on for quite a few days. And so it took a lot of time to construct. But and then of course the public reaction, a lot of people just hated it, and a lot of people to this day still hate it and don't consider it Beatles music. And one legendary discussion with John was saying that he felt like the Beatles should move in that more in that direction, and he even suggested the idea that Revolution Number 9 should be released as the next Beatles single. And fascinatingly enough, there is a 1968 single mix of the Revolution Number 9, which is quite an artifact to have, and I'm going to post that below so you can check it out. It would have been amazing if they had released that as a single. I mean, it would have been world shattering for a lot of people. But I now that I'm completely versed in music concrete and sound collage and the like, when I go back to listen to Revolution Number 9, I find it extremely musical, and I find it actually a lot more successful than a lot of avant-garde composers that make their living at it. And that's to be expected. John came at it with fresh ears, a very musical, traditional musical mind, and I'm not surprised that he arranged something that turned out to be pretty musical, because it does ebb and flow. It has a pulse to it with the repeating engineer voice saying number 9, number 9. And that gives the piece a real cohesion because it's a thread that runs through the whole thing. And then it also has a lot of musical elements because samples of 6 or 7 different composers and symphonies were used in it. So there's a very excellent musical aspect to it that helps it succeed as a piece of music. And then such a wide range of interesting samples put in there that were layered on top of it. And again, I think the layering of it adds to the musicality of it, because you have a basic pulse with the engineer voice saying number 9. You have all these musical elements and actual musical tones, and a classical element to it with the sampling of all these different symphonies. And it just succeeds as a piece of music. It just really succeeds as a piece of music. I think it has a great musicality to it that's missing from a lot of experimental music. And again, I suggest that the reason why is because John had a background in actual traditional music, and so when he approached this piece of music, he instinctively knew how to arrange things and have it have a certain range of dynamics, a nice ebb and flow, and a certain musicality to it. And I bring up this as well because, of course, John did other experimental albums on the Zappa label with the Wedding album and Life of the Lions, and also did another experimental piece called What's the New Mary Jane. Though it's not a sound collage per se, it definitely has a breadth of vision that shows that John was thinking in broader terms, using a lot of untraditional elements. But I started thinking about that more recently because a YouTuber basically deconstructed and isolated a bunch of the parts of Revolution number 9, so you can clearly see all the elements that were put into making this piece of music, and it makes it all that much more fascinating. And then there's a bunch of stuff on YouTube. The mono mix is a little different. There's a version on there that's reversed. There's versions that are different mixes, and it shows all the possibilities of that piece of music, and I find them all relatively successful. And also, interestingly enough, there's been a couple of live performances of Revolution 9, different classical musicians and ambitious musician types have actually performed the piece live using live instrumentation and sampled sounds and everything, and it's pretty incredible. And I think it gives it even more um, credibility as a piece of music that's is standing the test of time. And it definitely was looking into the future. And once again, it was recorded in 1968, and now here it is all these years later, and it's just a matter of fact piece of Beatles history and the White Album, and seems completely home. And the White Album would have been at a loss if that wasn't included. And granted, they could have included two more Beatles songs, traditional Beatles songs like "Not Guilty" or something, instead of putting that on there. And the fact that they made that choice, I think, says a lot for the band. So that's my bottom line: the fact that they were so adventurous to conceive of that piece of music and then come to a consensus, include it on the White Album. Very brave. Probably only the Beatles could get away with it, although one could argue that some of the sound collage work on Frank Zappa's first two albums was a predecessor to it. Those are definitely ambitious, but people expect that from Frank Zappa. But his sound collage work, again, I think is incredible and has a musicality to it that's missing from a lot of the so-called avant-garde. So anyway, I stand by Revolution number 9. I love it. I don't find it scary or jarring or a bad piece of music or a bad piece of Beatles music. I've come to think of it as a masterpiece. I'm glad it's on the White Album. I totally love it. It would have been interesting if John had done an entire album of that kind of material, another lost opportunity. But that said, Revolution number 9 is a masterpiece. I'm Brian Fox. Thanks for watching I Hate Rock Music.